Princess Catherine had made her decision, and this time there would be no quiet retreat behind palace walls. She was stepping forward to carry forward the causes Diana once championed, and everyone close to the family understood that once this choice became public, the balance inside the palace would never look the same again. What had begun as a private conversation with the king was about to become something far larger, a visible reshaping of royal duty itself. But the reasons behind Catherine's decision reached back further than anyone realized into a quieter, more personal chapter of her own life. Before we go any further, take a moment to subscribe so you never miss the next royal investigation. Stories like this rarely end where they begin. To understand why Catherine chose this moment, we need to return to a private conversation that took place weeks before the world ever heard her name mentioned alongside Diana's legacy again. The private study at Windsor was quiet when Catherine asked to speak with the king alone. No aides lingered by the door, no private secretary took notes in the corner, just the two of them and a slim leather folder resting on the table between them, the kind used only for matters the palace considered delicate. Charles recognized the folder before she opened it. He had seen versions of it before filled with the names of patronages, causes, and charities passed down through generations of royal women. But nothing prepared him for what Catherine said next. She told him gently, but without hesitation, that she wanted to formally take on a cluster of patronages currently held by Camilla, not all of them, not as a challenge to her position, but specific causes, ones with deep and unmistakable ties to Diana's own legacy. Children's hospices, mental health outreach, the quiet, unglamorous work that rarely made headlines but had once defined how the public first fell in love with a young princess of Wales decades earlier. For a long moment, Charles said nothing at all. Those who know him well would later describe that silence as uncharacteristic. Charles was a man rarely at a loss for words, especially on matters concerning the institution he had spent his entire life preparing to protect. But in that moment, sitting across from his daughter-in-law, he seemed unable to immediately respond. Catherine did not fill the silence. She simply waited, watching him process what she had just proposed, understanding better than anyone in that room what this request might stir in him. She was not merely asking to take on new responsibilities. She was asking to step quite deliberately into causes shaped by the woman whose loss had defined so much of Charles's own complicated history. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured, careful in a way that suggested he was choosing every word. He asked her why now? Why these particular causes? Why, after years of the Waleses building their own distinct public identity, separate from the past, she wanted to draw such a direct line back to Diana? Catherine's answer, according to those briefed on the conversation afterward, was simple and unshaken. She said it was not about the past, it was about continuity. About making sure certain kinds of work that mattered deeply to vulnerable families and struggling children did not quietly fade from royal attention simply because circumstances had changed. But there was something else beneath her words, something Charles seemed to sense immediately. This was not only about causes and patronages, this felt personal to her in a way she had not fully explained. Charles studied the folder again, flipping through pages of charity names and outreach programs, many of which he recognized instantly. Some had once been visited by Diana herself, photographed with children in hospital wards or community centers, moments that had become iconic images of a different era in royal history. Others were newer causes Camilla had built carefully over her own years in public life. The weight of what Catherine was proposing became clearer with every page. This was not a small administrative adjustment. This was a visible, symbolic shift in how the public would perceive the current generation of royal women, and by extension, how they might interpret the family's relationship with Diana's memory. Charles closed the folder slowly. He did not give Catherine an answer that day. Instead, he asked for time to consider what such a change would mean not only for the institution, but for Camilla herself, who had spent decades earning her place within it. Catherine accepted this without argument, though those present noted a quiet resolve in her expression as she left the study. Whatever Charles ultimately decided, it was clear she did not intend to abandon the idea. What no one in that room could have anticipated was how quickly word of the conversation would begin to spread through the palace, or how differently each member of the family would react once they learned what Catherine had proposed. News of Catherine's proposal did not stay contained within the walls of Windsor for long. Within days, it had reached the small circle of senior aides who managed the daily rhythms of royal life, and from there it inevitably found its way to the people it would affect most directly. William was the first to hear it from Catherine herself. He listened carefully as she explained her reasoning, and those close to the couple described his reaction as a mixture of pride and quiet concern. He understood immediately why these particular causes mattered to her. He had watched her recovery unfold over recent years, had seen how deeply she had come to value the kind of work that helped families quietly without spectacle. But he also worried about the toll such a public undertaking might take, especially so soon after she had deliberately scaled back her pace to protect her health and her time with their children. He did not try to talk her out of it. Instead, he asked her one question that stayed with her for days afterward. He asked if she was doing this because it was truly what she wanted, or because some part of her felt she needed to prove something to Diana's memory, to the public, or perhaps even to herself. Catherine did not have an immediate answer. Camilla learned of the conversation through a more indirect channel, a passing comment from a member of the household staff who assumed she already knew. Those who observed her reaction in the hours that followed described it as measured, controlled, giving away little of what she actually felt. It was several noted exactly the kind of composure she had spent decades cultivating in public life. Privately, however, the news landed differently. Camilla had built her public role slowly and deliberately, patronage by patronage, engagement by engagement, often under intense scrutiny and public skepticism that had taken years to soften. To hear that some of those very causes might now be handed to someone else, however well-intentioned, touched something she rarely allowed others to see. She said little to Charles that evening, though those nearby noted a change in her demeanor, a quietness that lingered through dinner and into the following morning. Princess Anne's reaction stood in sharp contrast to the uncertainty surrounding everyone else. When she was briefed on Catherine's proposal, her response was notably practical. She had long believed that royal patronages should follow genuine passion and capacity rather than rigid tradition, and she saw nothing troubling in Catherine wanting to take on causes she felt personally connected to. If anything, Anne viewed it as exactly the kind of forward momentum the institution needed, a reminder that public service should evolve with each generation rather than remain frozen in place. She reportedly told Charles directly that hesitation over optics should not stand in the way of good instincts, and that Catherine's instincts on this matter seemed sound. Yet even as Anne offered her support, the emotional undercurrents within the family remained far more complicated than any single conversation could resolve. William found himself caught between admiration for his wife's conviction and a quiet worry about what public reaction might follow, particularly if the shift were perceived as pushing Camilla aside, rather than honoring Diana's memory. Charles, for his part, remained largely withdrawn on the subject in the days after his conversation, with Catherine offering no clear indication of which way he was leaning. Those closest to him sensed that this hesitation was not about doubting Catherine's sincerity, but about something deeper, a reluctance to reopen emotional territory he had spent years learning to navigate carefully. It was Camilla who finally broke the silence between herself and Charles, choosing a quiet evening to raise the subject directly rather than allow it to fester unspoken. What she said to him in that conversation would ultimately shape everything that followed, though at the time neither of them fully understood how far the consequences would reach. To understand what truly drove Catherine's decision, it helps to look past the folder she carried into that private meeting with Charles and back toward a quieter season in her own life, one that had little to do with palace politics and everything to do with recovery. In the years since her illness, Catherine had spoken publicly, though sparingly, about how deeply that period had reshaped her sense of purpose. She had described finding unexpected comfort in creativity and nature, in the slower rhythms of family life that illness had forced upon her. Friends close to her noted that this shift was not merely about scaling back public duties, it was about rethinking from the ground up what kind of public role she actually wanted to hold once she returned to it. During the long stretches of recovery when public engagements were limited and her days revolved largely around her children, Catherine had found herself returning often to memories of Diana, not as a distant historical figure, but as someone whose approach to public service had always felt personal rather than performative. She recalled stories William had shared over the years, quiet visits Diana had made to hospices and shelters, often without press cameras present, simply sitting with families in some of the hardest moments of their lives. One particular memory resurfaced repeatedly during Catherine's recovery, a story William had told her about his mother's visits to a children's hospice in Wales, a place Diana had supported quietly for years before her death. Catherine had never visited the facility herself, but the story stayed with her, taking on new meaning as she navigated her own uncertain health journey alongside her children. When she eventually returned to public engagements, one of her first personal choices, made independently of any grand announcement, was to formally take on patronage of that very hospice. It was a small gesture at the time, largely overlooked by wider coverage focused on her broader return to duties. But for Catherine, it represented something significant. A quiet continuation of a legacy she felt deeply connected to, even though she had never known Diana personally. That single act of patronage became in many ways the seed of everything that followed. According to those close to the family, it was a private conversation with George, Charlotte, and Louis that ultimately pushed Catherine toward the larger decision she brought to Charles. During a quiet evening at home, one of her children had asked her about their grandmother, Diana, prompted by a photograph they had seen in an old family album. Catherine found herself struggling to answer questions about what Diana had actually done beyond the broad strokes of her public image. The moment stayed with her long after the conversation ended. She realized that her children were growing up with only a distant secondhand understanding of the causes that had once defined Diana's public life, causes that had since been carried forward by other family members but rarely discussed in terms of their original origin. Catherine began quietly researching the full scope of patronages Diana had once held, many of which had since passed to Camilla as the family's public roles evolved over the years. What she found surprised her: a deep, sprawling network of causes touching children's health, mental health awareness, and community support work that had continued steadily, but had, in her view, drifted somewhat from its original emotional resonance. It was this realization, more than any desire for prominence or symbolism, that led Catherine to approach Charles. She wanted her children to grow up understanding not just who Diana had been, but what she had actually done. And she believed the clearest way to teach that lesson was to visibly continue that work herself. What William did not yet know, and what Catherine had not fully shared even with him, was just how personal this decision had become, rooted not in institutional strategy but in a quiet promise she had made to herself during the hardest months of her recovery. When Charles finally called Catherine back for a second conversation, he had made a decision, though not the kind of clean, decisive verdict his advisors had hoped for. Instead, he wanted to understand more fully what she was truly asking for before committing to anything. They met again in the same quiet study, though this time Charles had asked for the conversation to remain strictly private, without notes taken, without any record beyond what the two of them would later choose to share. He began by acknowledging what Catherine had said in their first meeting, that this was not about rivalry, not about diminishing Camilla, but about continuity and memory. Still, he pressed her further, wanting to understand the practical shape of what she envisioned. Catherine explained that she was not asking to take over every cause connected to Diana at once. She wanted to begin with a small, carefully chosen group of patronages, ones with the clearest ties to children's welfare and mental health support areas where she already felt a natural personal connection through her own public work and her own family's experiences. Charles listened without interrupting, though his expression remained difficult to read. When she finished, he asked the question that had clearly been weighing on him since their first conversation. He wanted to know how she thought Camilla would receive this, not in official statements, but truly privately, as a woman who had spent years earning her place within the family. Catherine admitted she did not know for certain, but she believed Camilla, more than most people realized, understood the importance of legacy and continuity within royal life. She said she hoped this would be seen not as a loss for Camilla, but as an evolution that honored everyone's contributions, past and present. Charles fell quiet again, and for a moment something shifted in his expression that those familiar with him would later describe as unmistakably emotional. He spoke briefly about how difficult it had been for him personally over the years to navigate public memory of Diana, how every gesture, every mention, every echo of her legacy carried weight he could never fully escape even decades later. He told Catherine that he did not doubt her sincerity, but that she needed to understand the full weight of what she was proposing, not just for herself, but for how the public and the press would inevitably frame it. Any transfer of patronage connected to Diana risked being portrayed as a referendum on Camilla, regardless of how carefully worded any official statement might be. Catherine acknowledged this risk, directly telling Charles she understood the potential for public misinterpretation, but that she believed avoiding meaningful action out of fear of how it might be perceived was in itself a disservice to the causes involved. She said she would rather navigate difficult headlines than let the work quietly fade from public attention. It was at this point that Charles asked her the question that would ultimately shape his decision. He asked whether she was prepared to speak with Camilla directly before any formal announcement to ensure this transition happened with dignity and mutual respect, rather than becoming another source of palace tension playing out in public. Catherine agreed without hesitation, saying she had in fact hoped to have exactly that conversation from the very beginning. Charles studied her for a long moment before finally responding, his voice quieter than usual. He told her that if she could navigate that conversation with the same sincerity she had shown him, he would support her requests, though he asked for the transition to happen gradually, patronage by patronage rather than as a single sweeping announcement. It was not the swift, dramatic decision some in the palace had anticipated, but for Catherine it was enough. She had not sought permission for a symbolic gesture. She had sought a genuine opportunity to carry something meaningful forward, and Charles, despite his own complicated history with the subject, had finally given her the chance to try. What remained now was the far more delicate task ahead, sitting down with Camilla herself and finding out whether the woman most directly affected by this decision would meet it with the same grace Catherine hoped for. Before Catherine could sit down with Camilla, the machinery of the palace itself had to begin moving. Royal patronages are rarely reassigned on personal agreement alone. Behind every quiet handshake or private conversation lies a web of paperwork, protocol, and institutional review that determines how such a transition is actually carried out. Private secretaries from both households were quietly briefed within days of Charles giving his conditional approval. For Catherine's team, this meant reviewing the practical realities of adding new patronages to an already carefully managed Schedule 1 that had been deliberately kept lighter since her return to public life. For Camilla's office, it meant something more delicate, identifying which causes could reasonably be handed over without it appearing as though she were being stripped of her role altogether. The timing of this internal process carried its own quiet significance. It came just as preparations were already underway for William and Catherine to formally take on their long-anticipated role as grantors of royal warrants, a distinction not held by a Princess of Wales since the early 1900s, and one that Diana herself had never been granted during her own lifetime. Advisors on both sides recognized the symbolic weight of these two developments unfolding so closely together, one honoring institutional tradition, the other honoring personal legacy. Discussions between the two households were notably formal, at first conducted largely through intermediaries rather than direct conversation. Camilla's team requested a full list of the specific patronages Catherine wished to take on, along with a clear rationale for each choice. Catherine provided this without hesitation, careful to frame every selection around genuine personal connection rather than any broader statement about Camilla's existing work. The first cause identified for transition was the one closest to Catherine's heart, formal recognition of her ongoing support for the children's hospice in Wales that Diana had once quietly championed. Because Catherine had already been personally involved with the organization for some time, this transition proved the most straightforward, requiring little more than updated documentation and a coordinated announcement. Other causes proved more complicated. Several mental health initiatives Camilla had spent years building relationships around required more careful negotiation, not because of reluctance on Camilla's part, but because those organizations themselves had grown accustomed to her specific style of engagement and worried about disruption during the handover. Palace officials involved in the process later described these weeks as unusually delicate, requiring constant reassurance to outside charities that this was not a dismissal of previous efforts, but an expansion of royal support rather than a redirection away from existing commitments. Throughout this period, Camilla remained largely silent in public, continuing her scheduled engagements without any visible change in demeanor. Those working closely with her noted that she approached the transition with the same measured professionalism she had shown throughout her years of public service, even as questions lingered about what she truly felt beneath that composure. Meanwhile, speculation had begun quietly circulating among royal watchers and journalists who noticed subtle shifts in engagement schedules, though nothing had been formally announced. Rumors started to spread that some kind of realignment was underway within the family's public duties, though details remained unclear even to those closest to the story. It was during this uncertain period, with paperwork still being finalized and no public statement yet prepared, that Catherine finally requested the conversation she had promised Charles she would have. She reached out directly to Camilla, asking for a private meeting, just the two of them, away from advisors, away from carefully worded briefing notes, to discuss everything honestly before any formal transition moved forward. Camilla agreed to the meeting without hesitation, though she gave no indication beforehand of how she intended to respond. For those watching from within the palace, this quiet, unscripted conversation between the two women would ultimately determine whether this entire initiative moved forward with genuine unity, or whether it would become another quiet fracture within a family already accustomed to navigating public and private tension in equal measure. The meeting between Catherine and Camilla took place quietly, away from any official calendar entry, in a private sitting room rather than a formal office. Neither woman brought aides, neither brought notes. What was said between them that afternoon was never fully disclosed, but those who saw them both afterward noted a subtle shift in the atmosphere surrounding the entire initiative. Within days, the first visible signs of the transition began appearing in public. Catherine's formal patronage of the children's hospice in Wales was quietly confirmed through official channels, framed simply as an expansion of her existing charitable work rather than any dramatic reassignment. The announcement drew little immediate attention on its own, but longtime royal observers quickly recognized its deeper significance, tracing the connection back to Diana's own quiet history with the organization decades earlier. Soon after Catherine appeared at a formal military engagement in her role as Colonel of the Irish Guards, an appearance that took on unexpected symbolic weight. She wore for the occasion the same sapphire drop earrings once belonging to Diana, a detail immediately noticed by those watching closely. It was a small choice, subtle rather than deliberate spectacle, but it reinforced the emotional thread running quietly beneath the entire transition. Camilla's public schedule shifted as well, though far less dramatically than early speculation had suggested. Rather than stepping back entirely, she began appearing alongside Catherine at select engagements tied to causes now shared between them, presenting a united front that surprised many who had expected visible tension. Still, sharper observers noted subtle differences. Camilla attended fewer solo engagements tied specifically to children's welfare initiatives, gradually allowing Catherine to take the lead at events that had for years been firmly associated with her own public identity. To those unfamiliar with the private negotiations behind the scenes, it appeared as a quiet, almost imperceptible handover. Royal commentators began piecing together the pattern, though, without access to any official confirmation of what was truly happening within the family. Early coverage remained cautious, careful not to overstate what could easily be dismissed as routine scheduling adjustments. But the accumulation of small symbolic details made it increasingly difficult to ignore that something more deliberate was unfolding. Within the palace itself, reactions to these visible changes varied considerably. Younger staff members, many of whom had only ever known Camilla as Queen Consort, expressed quiet admiration for what they interpreted as a graceful, dignified transition. Older staff, some of whom remembered Diana's own era firsthand, described a more complicated emotional response, watching history quietly echo itself in ways they had not expected to witness again. William, observing from a slight distance as both women navigated this delicate transition, later admitted privately to close friends that he had underestimated how smoothly this could unfold, having initially worried the shift might create lasting friction between his wife and stepmother. Charles, for his part, remained watchful throughout this period, quietly monitoring public reaction without direct intervention. Those close to him noted a mixture of relief and lingering unease: relief that the transition appeared to be proceeding without open conflict, unease that the deeper emotional weight of the situation, particularly for Camilla, had not yet fully surfaced. That unease proved well-founded. Despite her composed public appearances and apparent cooperation, throughout the process, Camilla had not yet spoken honestly, even to Charles, about what this transition truly meant to her on a personal level. Behind her carefully maintained public poise, something more complicated was quietly taking shape, a private reckoning she had not yet allowed herself to fully confront. It happened late one evening, long after the day's engagements had ended and the household had settled into quiet. Camilla found Charles alone in his study, the same room where his first conversation with Catherine had taken place weeks earlier. She had not planned to raise the subject that night, but the weight of it had grown too heavy to carry silently any longer. She told him plainly, and without the composure she had maintained so carefully in public, that she did not regret supporting the transition, but that it had stirred something in her she had not anticipated. For years, she explained, she had worked to build a public identity entirely her own, separate from comparisons to Diana, separate from the skepticism that had followed her for decades. Watching those very causes now quietly shift toward Catherine, however gracefully handled, had forced her to confront feelings she had long avoided examining too closely. Charles listened without interrupting, understanding this was not a moment for a reassurance offered too quickly. Camilla continued, admitting that part of her worried the public would remember this moment as proof that she had always been temporary, a placeholder before the real continuation of Diana's legacy eventually returned through someone else. It was a rare admission, one that revealed far more vulnerability than Camilla typically allowed herself to show, even to Charles. He took her hand and told her gently but firmly that nothing about this transition diminished what she had built over her own years of service. He reminded her that her contributions had shaped countless causes in ways entirely her own work that stood independently, regardless of how public patronages were eventually distributed among the family's next generation. Still, Camilla admitted she needed to reconcile these feelings on her own terms before she could fully embrace the transition publicly. She told Charles she did not want to simply issue a polished statement crafted by advisors expressing support she had not genuinely worked through internally first. Charles respected this, telling her to take whatever time she needed and reassuring her that no further public steps would be taken until she felt ready to speak honestly, whether privately or publicly, about her own perspective on everything unfolding around her. In the days that followed, Camilla largely withdrew from public commentary on the subject, focusing instead on her existing engagements while quietly processing the personal weight of the transition. Those closest to her described this period as unusually reflective, noting, "She seemed more thoughtful, more measured even than usual as she worked through emotions she had rarely allowed herself to sit with so directly." Meanwhile, public speculation continued to build. Royal commentators, sensing a larger story developing beneath the surface, began openly questioning whether Camilla would ever formally address what many now suspected was a significant, if quietly handled, shift in the family's public representation of Diana's legacy. Pressure slowly mounted for some kind of official acknowledgement, not necessarily from the palace itself, but from the growing volume of public curiosity surrounding the story. Advisors gently suggested that Camilla might eventually need to address the situation directly, if only to prevent further speculation from filling the silence with assumptions far removed from the truth. Camilla remained hesitant, unwilling to be rushed into a statement before she felt genuinely ready. But circumstances were quickly approaching that would leave her little choice, as one particular upcoming engagement threatened to place her directly in the center of public attention, whether she felt prepared for it or not. By the time the story reached wider media attention, it had taken on a life of its own, far beyond the careful, incremental process that had actually unfolded behind palace walls. What began as quiet observations among royal commentators quickly escalated into full coverage across major outlets, each offering its own interpretation of what was really happening within the family. Headlines framed the story in strikingly different ways, depending on the publication. Some outlets portrayed it as a touching tribute, Catherine graciously carrying forward Diana's legacy after years of quiet recovery and reflection. Others adopted a far more provocative tone, suggesting Camilla was being deliberately sidelined, her decades of public service quietly erased in favor of a more sentimental, media-friendly narrative centered on Diana's memory. Social media amplified both interpretations rapidly. Older audiences, particularly those who remembered Diana's public life firsthand, expressed deep emotional reactions, many describing Catherine's actions as a beautiful, overdue continuation of causes they felt had drifted from public consciousness since Diana's death. Comment sections filled with nostalgic reflections, personal stories about how Diana's visits to hospitals and hospices had touched ordinary families decades earlier. Younger audiences, less connected to that specific history, responded differently, focusing instead on Catherine's own journey through illness and recovery, framing her renewed public role as an authentic, deeply personal choice rather than simply an echo of the past. For many in this demographic, the story resonated less as royal legacy and more as a broader narrative about resilience and purpose following hardship. Meanwhile, criticism aimed at how Camilla was being treated grew louder in certain corners of public discourse. Commentators questioned whether the palace had adequately considered how this transition would affect public perception of her decades-long effort to build a respected, independent public identity. Some accused the family of quietly rewriting recent history, allowing Camilla's contributions to fade prematurely in favor of a more emotionally compelling narrative centered on Diana. Inside the palace, communications teams found themselves managing an increasingly complicated situation, one that had grown far beyond their original expectations for a gradual low-key transition. Advisors debated whether to issue a formal statement clarifying the intentions behind the change, or whether doing so might only draw further attention to a story they had hoped would settle naturally over time. Charles, monitoring the escalating coverage from a careful distance, grew increasingly concerned about the toll this public scrutiny might be taking on both Catherine and Camilla, each already navigating deeply personal emotions privately without needing the added pressure of public debate over their intentions and motivations. William, too, found himself frustrated watching the narrative spiral in directions he felt oversimplified what he knew to be a far more nuanced, thoughtfully handled situation. He pushed advisors to consider some form of clarification, though he remained wary of anything that might feel like the family were being forced into a defensive public statement. It was Camilla ultimately who decided the moment had come to speak for herself, rather than allow others to continue shaping the narrative around her silence. She informed Charles quietly that she intended to address the situation directly in her own words at an upcoming public engagement already scheduled weeks earlier, one that would place her alongside both Catherine and William for the first time since the transition had begun. Charles offered his full support, though he cautioned her against feeling pressured to say more than she genuinely felt ready to share. Camilla assured him she had made peace with what she wanted to say, even if she could not yet predict how the public would ultimately receive it. What none of them could have anticipated was just how much attention that single previously routine engagement was about to receive, transforming what should have been a quiet public appearance into one of the most closely watched royal moments of the entire year. The engagement itself had originally been scheduled as a modest, unremarkable visit, a return trip to the children's hospice in Wales that had quietly become the emotional center of everything unfolding within the family. What had once been planned as a routine outing for Catherine alone had, by the time the day arrived, become something far larger, drawing intense media presence and public anticipation that surprised even those who had helped plan it months earlier. Catherine arrived first, dressed simply, deliberately avoiding anything that might overshadow the purpose of the visit itself. She spent time with the children and families at the facility exactly as she always had, without pretense, without visible awareness of the cameras documenting every small interaction. Staff members later remarked that her presence felt genuine rather than performative, consistent with the quiet dedication she had shown to the cause long before any public attention had gathered around it. What surprised observers was Camilla's arrival shortly afterward, unannounced, beyond a brief note added to the day's schedule the previous evening. She entered quietly without any indication of tension and moved directly toward Catherine rather than maintaining polite distance for the cameras. The two women greeted each other warmly, a moment immediately captured by photographers who had been anticipating exactly this kind of encounter since speculation began weeks earlier. Together, they toured the facility, speaking with staff, sitting with families, offering a visible, unforced display of unity that stood in sharp contrast to the tension many had assumed existed between them. Camilla's presence seemed to reinforce rather than compete with Catherine's role, an image that quickly circulated widely once released to the public. Charles arrived later in the day, joining both women for a brief closing portion of the visit. Those present described him as visibly moved, particularly during a quiet moment when Catherine introduced him to a young patient whose family had specifically requested to meet him, having followed the family's connection to Diana's legacy through recent coverage. It was during this final portion of the visit that Camilla chose to speak publicly for the first time about the transition. Standing beside Catherine, she offered brief, unscripted remarks to the small gathering of press present, expressing genuine support for the continuation of causes she had long cared about, herself framing the moment not as an ending but as an expansion of work she remained personally committed to in her own way. Her words carried unmistakable warmth, free of the guarded formality many had expected. She spoke about the importance of consistency in supporting vulnerable families, regardless of which member of the family carried a particular patronage forward, emphasizing that the work itself mattered far more than who received public credit for it. Catherine, visibly moved by Camilla's words, responded with her own brief remarks, thanking Camilla directly for her graciousness throughout the transition and acknowledging publicly for the first time the personal journey that had led her to this particular cause. The moment quickly became one of the most widely shared images of the entire year, not because of any dramatic revelation, but because of its quiet, genuine emotional resonance. 3 generations of royal women, each shaped by different circumstances, standing together in visible support of shared purpose. Afterward, away from the cameras, the 3 shared a brief private conversation, inside the facility, details of which were never fully disclosed publicly. What was said in that quiet moment, according to those closest to the family, would go on to shape not only how this particular transition was ultimately remembered, but how future generations within the family approached questions of legacy, memory, and shared purpose moving forward. In the weeks that followed the visit to the hospice in Wales, the intense media speculation that had once surrounded the transition gradually softened into something quieter, more settled. The images of Catherine and Camilla standing together and Camilla's own unscripted words of support had done more to calm public uncertainty than any formal palace statement could have achieved. Catherine settled fully into her expanded public role, balancing her existing commitments with the new patronages she had taken on, careful still to protect the boundaries around family time she had fought so hard to maintain throughout her recovery. Those close to her noted that she approached this new chapter with quiet confidence rather than any sense of pressure to prove herself worthy of the causes she now represented. Her visible connection to Diana's legacy no longer felt to most observers like an attempt to recreate the past. Instead, it read as something more organic, a continuation shaped by her own experiences, her own recovery, and her own understanding of what these causes meant to the families they served. The sapphire earrings, the hospice patronage, the quiet dedication to children's welfare. All of it had become simply part of who she was rather than a deliberate echo of someone else's story. Camilla, for her part, found unexpected clarity in the months that followed. Rather than feeling diminished by the transition, she discovered a renewed sense of purpose in the causes she retained, freed from some of the pressure she had long carried to represent every possible aspect of the family's charitable identity on her own. She began focusing more deeply on a smaller set of initiatives, particularly those centered on literacy and support for survivors of domestic hardship, areas where her personal commitment had always run especially deep. Her relationship with Catherine, once shadowed by public assumptions of quiet rivalry, evolved into something more openly collaborative. The 2 were seen together at several engagements throughout the following months, their public partnership becoming, in the eyes of many royal observers, one of the more reassuring developments within the family during an otherwise turbulent period for the monarchy. Charles, watching this transition ultimately settle into something stable and dignified, later reflected privately to close advisors that he had underestimated how meaningfully younger members of the family could carry legacy forward without erasing what came before. He noted that Diana's memory, rather than existing as a fixed, static image frozen in time, had instead found new life through Catherine's own genuine personal connection to similar causes. William, too, found himself reflecting on how the entire situation had unfolded, admitting to those close to him that his initial worries about public backlash had been in many ways unfounded. What could have easily become another chapter of tension and division within the family had instead become a quiet demonstration of how legacy, when handled with sincerity rather than obligation, could bring people together rather than pulling them apart. As the year continued, references to the transition faded gradually from headlines, replaced by newer stories and fresh royal developments. But those who had followed the story closely understood that something meaningful had shifted permanently within the family's public identity. A quiet reminder that legacy was never something to be owned by a single person, but something carried forward, reshaped and renewed by each generation in their own way. In the end, what began as a private conversation in a quiet study at Windsor had grown into something far larger than anyone initially anticipated, not a story of rivalry or replacement, but a rare, genuine example of how memory, purpose, and family could evolve together without abandoning the past and without being trapped by it either.